Democrats and liberals are more likely to favor legalization than Republicans or conservatives. And if you put them together in the smaller groups, liberal Democrats are very strongly for legalization, conservative Republicans are strongly against. But what's striking is that there are very large minorities in each of these groups, liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat, who dissent from the dominant view. Thus, do 37% of both conservatives and Republicans favor legalization. Thus, do 39% of Democrats and 25% of liberals oppose it. The relatively small partisan gap in comparison with other issues can partly be explained by the fact that Republicans are nearly as likely as Democrats to say they have used marijuana. 43% of Republicans reported past use, as did 47% of Democrats. Perhaps this gives us some ideas of how we can reach a budget deal on Capitol Hill. Reported use among whites and blacks is identical, but much lower among Hispanic. And there is agreement across partisan lines, and this goes to one of the central points that the bill underscored, that government efforts to enforce marijuana laws cost more than they are worth. You'll see this on one of the charts. This view is held by 72% of all Americans, 78% of Democrats, 78% of independents, 71% of Democrats, 67% of Republicans. Similar split among liberals, moderates, and conservative. It's also striking that even among opponents of legalization, there is great skepticism about the value of enforcing laws against marijuana and significant support for giving states that legitimize it leeway to carry out their experiments. It turns out that there are a lot of conservatives who not only mouth slogans about states' rights, but actually believe them. Conservatives are among the strongest opponents of legalization, and yet their traditional sympathy for states' rights and also their skepticism about government efficacy weakens their support for strong enforcement. If you, on the direct question, this is all from the Pew survey, if the federal government should or should not enforce federal marijuana laws in states that have decided to allow its use, 57% of Republicans and 52% of conservatives said that the federal government should not enforce its own prohibitions. Bear in mind, these are groups that are opposed to the legalization of marijuana. The gap among Republicans between the proportion supporting legalization and the proportion who nonetheless want the federal government to stand down in the face of legalization's efforts is 20 points. For conservatives, that gap is 15 points. It's also, in a way, nice to know that Democrats and liberals are somewhat consistent on this as well. There's no states' rights gap for Democrats and liberals. The proportion of Democrats who oppose legalization is 39%, and those who favor federal anti-marijuana law enforcement of marijuana laws in the face of state action is 35%, a 4-point gap. Liberals are almost identical on the two questions. So that if the argument, I think this could have some very important consequences as the debate over what the federal government should do on this issue goes forward. Democrats and liberals won't want the federal government to enforce these laws because they are actually sympathetic to legalization, but a whole lot of Republicans and conservatives won't want the federal government to enforce these laws because they're sympathetic to states' rights.